Welcome back to the Medicine Podcast. My name is Mimi, and I have my king, my lover in this life and all others with me here.
What is going on, everybody? We're so fired up for this conversation today. I said it before we started recording, but we have our new best friend on the line. Welcome to the podcast, the Medicine Podcast. Nathan Riley, so glad you're here, my man.
What is up, my fam? It is really, really nice to be here with you. We had such a fun recording on my show, and I'm so glad we get to, toss around some questions from your side and get in the weeds a little bit. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. And we have so many questions. Like, honestly, it was hard to narrow it down to like what will fit inside a 1 to 2 hour podcast episode. And one thing that I love, I've shared this with you, but I'll share it with our listeners. One thing I love about you so much is that you make it very clear, first and foremost, you wear many hats and have so many different areas of expertise that you work with and consult people in. But one of the things that I appreciate most about you is that you are first and foremost a patient advocate, whoever you're working with, or a client, as you call them, which is so beautiful. And it is separate from maybe even some of your own personal beliefs and opinions. And I think in today's world, especially for the medical community, that is very rare. So I just wanted to extend gratitude for you. I know that if we ever had a question or, sending people to you, that I would be so just fully confident in your ability to treat that individual person based on their needs, which is just incredible.
I appreciate that. Thank you. One little piece of my platform is I do a lot of the biohacking and the functional medicine and everything, but we definitely have to start customizing our care for individuals, so the things that work for you, Chase, are not going to work for Mimi and vice versa. So when we go to the medical system, we all complain about being put into a, labeled and put into a box. We should be, equally, resourceful in meeting the individual needs of a woman or a man, even outside of the allopathic system. And when we get caught in that diagnosis, treatment sort of labeling process, that's, I think, where the conventional medical model went wrong and is steering people not towards a path of vitality, but just merely avoiding death, right? Like we could make the same mistakes, in other words, in the quote alternative therapy world, if we're not careful about like really taking a step back and considering what is this person's story, why are they here, and where are they going? And and that's why people find me. That's why people want to work with me. And I'm also the first to admit I don't know, but let's figure it out. So I have the luxury of doing that.
Trust you more.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. You can't get out of the woods until you realize and recognize and acknowledge that you're lost.
Right. It takes a confident person to be able to be like, I'm not really sure, but let's figure it out.
Yeah. And that's what not a lot of people are able to do what I do because they're still bound by a system that incentivizes productivity over what works. Necessarily. And, a lot of people find a lot of reprieve in the system. And then a lot of other people feel more broken after they've started the surgery and pharmaceutical routes. So there's not a one size fits all. And as you said, I'm a patient advocate. If a C-section is what a person really desires, we talk about what that all means to make sure that they have all the information and understanding. It's not my job to tell them what to do or not to do, have a home birth or a hospital birth or whatever else in my OB practice. It's like, what's important to you? And if a person feels more safe in the system, let's get you as healthy as possible so that the system can serve you.
Sure. Yeah. I think we've all just been groomed to want a step-by-step solution with a clear, predefined answer. And all we need to do is just kind of like follow the steps. Just tell me what the freaking steps are. And that's in every lane. That's in health. That's in, what happens after I die, subscription to various, religious institutions or businesses. Yeah. And the reality is like going back to the kind of the forest analogy is like, nobody really knows the way through the forest, but there are people like you who have studied it thoroughly. And there's this very intellectual pillar of your ability to navigate through the forest. And then you've also honed your senses. You've developed the ability to pick up and read and intuitively navigate your way through the forest. And it's this combination of both of those things, call them the masculine and the feminine, if you will. But it's I'm with you in this. We're going to get through this. But I'm not going to be able to tell you step A through Z to perfection and where exactly we're going to end up.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, as you were saying that, I was imagining like I'm the hermit who's wandered through the woods a whole bunch of
Yeah.
times and found a bunch of dead ends, and I'm meeting you at that like crossroads or the Y.
Yeah.
I'm like, guys, if you go this way, here's what you can expect. It might be good for you, but there's also this other path that I think is actually pretty great for a lot of people. And so
Mhm.
because I have the experience and you know, I've hit a lot of the pitfalls myself within the medical establishment, it does serve some people. You know, like we've talked about before, if you got a knife through your eye or something, you probably don't want to pray that away or go to the herbalist. You probably need to go and get some emergency surgery, like right now. Go down that path as fast as you can.
Yeah.
Yeah,
On the other hand, knowing what's down that path, there's some things there, but there's also a lot of love and light on this side as well. So
yeah, love that. Love
Sure.
that approach.
yeah.
We are so excited to jump into all things holistic, pregnancy, birth, death, all the controversial topics in between for sure. But first, every guest gets this first question, and that is, what do you love in your life? What aspect of your life do you love so much that you wish you could gift it to every human?
This is an easy one for me. I think I even actually alluded to this when we last spoke, but the if everybody had a woman in their life like my wife, especially every man, it would be this would be an easy go in a lot of ways. I mean, it could be quite challenging as well. But when you have a person in your life who's willing to allow you to show up authentically as yourself, flaws and all, mistakes and all, and say, hey, listen, you tried, it didn't work out. I'm with you. Let's go around the corner and see what's around the bend. You know, I think having a person like that in our life, and that's not to say everybody should be married and have kids and all that other stuff, but when you have a person who shows up like that for you and just holds you in the way that we need to be held, it gives us permission to make mistakes, to admit that we don't know, to admit that we're wrong, and really to express the full range of emotions that come with being a person. So that is the gift. If anybody out there knows another Stephanie Riley, or Stephanie, her maiden name, you're going to be better off getting to know somebody like that and having them in your corner.
I totally feel that.
Yeah.
Just a true
word
down homey partner that is also super sexy, and you love, you know, like you love connecting on that level too. But like, I totally feel that. I mean, that is absolutely, if I were to answer that question that we gave you, it's someone who sees all of you. And in my case, how I articulate it is someone who sees all of me, sees my soul, also allows me to show up as my authentic self, and loves every bit, thinks every bit is beautiful in some way. And that is the ultimate gift.
Yeah. We were just talking about this the other day, like having that sort of love, that puzzle piece, ooey gooey, just seemingly perfect connection is like, it's like falling in love with your home and in your home community. It's like, I love this place, not just because the summers are killer, not just because, you know, there's a really fun mountain or ocean nearby. I love it for the fall, winter, spring, summer, every season, every attribute. I'm in love with it. I'm curious. I'm ready to see what's next. And it's different than just a place you would want to vacation. It's an actual like home energy that you can get with a human.
Amen. Yeah. And my wife is sexy as hell. Like, she is my dream girl. She always has been. We met when we were 16, as we talked about. And I just got lucky. You know, I didn't get to swim out there and meet all the fishes in the sea necessarily. And I'm okay with that. We had a period apart like you guys did. And it was like, man, I really just lucked out in the first pick of the woman I saw at like a diner when we were 16. I was like, I'm obsessed with this person. And fast forward, and she's also this emotionally just gifted and just such a supportive person. And I don't know. Yeah, I could go on and on about her.
Yeah.
So she's definitely my greatest asset.
We have a lot of similarities between our two stories in love. That is. Yeah,
totally. You know, another question I love to would hear your take on, and it should be an easy one, you know, easy yes or no. What are your views on God or the divine? Do you subscribe to any specific, you know, epistemology or religious practice?
That's a really good question. When you guys sent this question before, I gave a very short answer because I don't really know. I think it's a constantly evolving conversation for me. And as we have more experiences, I think it's natural for you to step back and say, man, does this fit into my worldview? I will say that, I was raised in a family. We never went to church. We had very little religious conversation in the house. But my parents sort of figured if you have questions about God or the after, the before, whatever, we can talk about it. And we did. And my parents also used a lot of psychedelics back in the day. So I think my mom and dad, it's a funny side story. When my dad passed away in medical school, we found a key to his secret cabinet. And he had a bunch of ammunition in there, and he had a bunch of cannabis in there, and a bunch of paraphernalia for using cannabis in various ways. But he also had a stack of philosophy books. And he had, everything was bookmarked and stuff. And I was like, man, if I had known that part of my dad, sort of conjurings, what sort of insights would have come to him if I had shared my experiences with birth, death, everything in between, the birth of our own daughter in our bedroom just 50 feet from us, and not to mention my own explorations with plant medicines and mushrooms. So I will have to put a pin in that. I think I probably most resonate with a combination of like a Taoist and a Buddhist, those kind of traditions, and also this sort of collective one that we perhaps are graced with after we pass through that portal at the end of our life, which I sort of frame as like the beginning of something quite beautiful. I feel like that's a privilege to step into that space. And I've been there through some really, really hard medicine journeys myself. So it's almost like a confirmation of what I experienced in the birth and death observations of just being present with these sacred transformations of spirit. So it's not an easy answer, but it's a great question.
Yeah, it is. We just dive right into the depths. And it is a difficult question to answer, especially if you tend to leave an open mind and not stay concrete on any one set of beliefs. I love the way that Paul Chek frames this as a belief system is by definition a closed system, which means that you either have to break some of your programming or unlearn to learn something else, or just completely, throw it away or denounce it or whatever if you want to move into something else. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I know I won't speak for Chase, but I believe we are similar here, where it's like, I don't know, but I'm really okay with not knowing. It makes life more magical, and there's not this like pressure to figure anything out. It's just like, I will take in information and experience as it serves me and feels authentic to me in my spiritual experience.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then if you go through some big something in your life, whether it could be really big, like a near-death experience, or it could be birth, a huge event. You could be faced with losing the person who's most important to you, like a grandfather, a mother, or whatever. It serves us to take a step back and kind of fit that into our worldview. I mean, if we're not willing to change, then we just continue on this path like we've talked about. And while it can be very confronting, it's also that's really where the growth is. Where you are afraid to go is actually where the biggest growth comes from.
Yeah. And I think at least for us, we have experiences that we can say, I think that was an experience of God. I think that was an interaction with God. But it's kind of like being blind and never having had a strawberry, and you just take a bite of a strawberry and somebody's like, hey, describe that. Give me your views on the strawberry. You're like, I don't know. I just had it and it was amazing, but I can't really go into the specifics on what the strawberry was. I'm just still somewhat blind to it. And we just don't have necessarily the rationale to be able to articulate God, but we can sure as hell experience it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's you don't know what you don't know. And once you get some new information, you pack that in, and that becomes a little part of you. And if you consider any of the great thinkers, I mean, Carl Jung, he was largely discarded by the medical community, but his own work, and like if you read his Red Book, which is in the background of many people's great libraries, he was getting something from somewhere else. Like it wasn't channeling necessarily. It was that he had this spiritual awakening, which helped him derive a completely understanding of human consciousness. Yeah. And that also made him look like a total quack, like Quackadoo, who got information from above in a time where we completely ignore the immeasurable
Right.
or the experience of a person. We actually are only interested in the empirical way of measuring, computing, etc., which was set forth by Rene Descartes. So our society and everybody, the medical system and everything, we all benefit from just being okay with being wrong.
Yeah.
And saying, I don't know.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that because that approach can then carry over into your work in the 3D world, which is, holistic OBGYN and birth and death care for your clients. On that note of staying open and being able to change your mind, obviously, we know that you're probably constantly learning and studying and taking in new information and running it through your system. When was the last time that you can remember significantly changing your mind about something, maybe in the pregnancy and fertility world, since we're going to get into that conversation, but also if anything else is just blaring, you can maybe speak to a few things if you like, but when was the last time you changed your mind on something?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question too. And the first thing that comes to mind is what happened these past couple of years with COVID and the pandemic, which is that, as a doctor, you work your whole life to get to a place where, you can put these things into practice after years of studying textbooks and practicing surgeries and all of that in residency. And what you hope is that, okay, there's a lot of medical literature that's being published every year around the world. We have a group of people called the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, known famously or notoriously as ACOG, who sets out the guidelines for us. And there's a group of people whose whole job is to review every piece of new literature and incorporate it into our guidelines. By doing that, it's the American College of Cardiologists, whatever, American Heart Association, not a heart association, the American, Pediatrics Association or whatever. Like every discipline, every specialty has their governing body who is there to serve us. They're there to help us in the same way that the CDC, working with, the FDA and NIH, they're supposed to get us healthy things that have less risks and a greater benefit to risk ratio. When you're in medicine, you're like, thank goodness we have these oversight bodies, right? Because they're doing all of the hard work. I can't possibly digest every single study that's coming out around the world. There's probably something like 10,000 trials going on at a time. So how am I supposed to digest that? Fortunately, we have these bodies that do that. The problem with the past couple of years has been that I've actually gone deeper into the actual medical publication world, because there was a Lancet study. It was like 90,000 people recruited from 120 countries that showed that hydroxychloroquine wasn't helpful. And it was like at the very beginning of the pandemic. And like a month later, the Lancet retracted. The Lancet's considered, widely regarded as probably one of the top 3 medical journals with integrity in the world. So the Lancet had this happen, and everybody was like, we haven't heard of any study like this happening. Like, is this a real? And so a month later, sure enough, tracked it, and they were like, "Oh, sorry, we didn't check out the sources of the data. Our bad." And I was like, if this is happening at the level of the Lancet, which is the peer review process, then we're in deep trouble. So then I started going down that rabbit hole, and Marcia Engel at the New England Journal had spoken out about pharmaceutical dollars really driving publication bias within our major medical journals. And the New England Journal is a top. I mean, it's not the Lancet, but it's definitely up there. And you have to consider there's like 5,000 journals. So we're talking the top 10. There's 2 of them that have already betrayed me. And then there was another, Michael McCarthy, at the former editor at the Lancet. He came up with a whole book on the sort of fraud within medical publications. And then lastly, John Giardini wrote a book called The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine. And between just those 3 of the many resources I started going down, I was like, oh no, all of the data that I'm utilizing in order to counsel my patients and me and my family and friends is corrupted. In other words, this isn't actually an exploration of truth. This is a selective publication based on who's giving the journal more money to put their study in there, which probably supports the drug that's advertised on the next page. And I'm not making any of this up. It was so disillusioning and dismantling for me, because now it's like, well, shit, I need to actually read every single study. And of course, I'm not going to do that, because I don't even know what conflicts of interest were in the minds of the people who put this study together. So that's not to say we should throw all of that out the window, but over the past 50 years, I think I've become very dubious of anything that's come out within the probably since World War II, because that's when the money started really flowing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Big pharma is so influential in this space that I just feel like, it's one little piece of information, but I gotta actually lean on what actually works and what my patients are telling me. And
Yeah.
a lot of what my patients are telling me, whether it's birth control, postpartum recovery, whatever, is not even reflected in the literature. And it's like, guys, we missed something here, and now I can't trust you. I mean, that's how I feel, and that's
Yeah.
a big thing to change your mind about, whether it be vaccines or pharmaceuticals or hospital birth versus home birth or whatever else. So
Yeah. That's a huge one. That's a really good
Yeah.
one. And I can imagine that, that is like a little bit it's shaking to your foundation of
That's
being
right.
a medical doctor and relying on, I was I'm a dental hygienist by degree, and we're taught the same thing, that we practice evidence-based, medicine, basically not medicine, but dental care. And it's ingrained in you. This is evidence-based medicine. We're looking at the studies, but you kind of have to approach it after seeing some of these corruptions, I guess, that, yeah, probably not everything is damaged or corrupted, but you have to, after experiencing that, at least approach it like that, and then have them like
Right.
basically prove you wrong that this is not in fact corrupt. And I can see how probably 99.9% of doctors and practitioners, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you feel like more, if you're seeing something different from the collective of doctors that you know and work with, but I can imagine how that would be so dismantling that you don't even want to touch it as a doctor. You're like, I can't even let my mind go there, because then what else in my life is a complete lie, is a complete sham.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, like within the religious community, right? We have all this stuff coming out about the Catholic Church. And even my wife asked recently, how are people still able to call themselves? This is not, I'm for or against any specific denomination of Christianity or otherwise. But she's like, how could you possibly hear this stuff and still feel like, you know what? My priest is probably the guy, and all the other guys are bad. That's, I think, how, through that cognitive I think that we just, it's too painful to admit that the bodies, and by the way, the CDC on all of the recommendations come from these journals. So the journals publish this, and the CDC's job is to say, here's what we think we should do regarding Z based on the available literature. So all of these bodies, if there's so much pharmaceutical dollars driving the research, then they're all just, I guess, not willing to look into the darkness and say, oh my God, what have we done?
Yeah.
Because that's really the shift we need. But I mean, just like with religions or politicians or whatever else, I think it's just so painful for people to look at the betrayal,
Yeah.
and to become disillusioned, because that's scary. Now what?
Now what?
Yeah.
Seriously.
Everything was a lie. Now what?
Right. It's we have this tendency to externalize our identity to labels and to
Right.
our resumes and to our accolades and our credentials. And so we work through life, we get in our 20s, 30s, 40s, and we have this list of all of the things that we can look at and say, that's me.
Mhm.
Right.
And so when those get threatened or disproved in certain lanes, it's this, who am I now? Because we've just externalized our identity and we've attached to labels, instead of this like understanding from the inside out of who we are, and
Right.
the real kind of like core value type themes, and less the literal, trophies and awards and resumes that suggest we're something. And I think it's literally that. It's this externalized breaking apart of our identity, and the big question of who am I without these?
Mhm.
Amen. Yeah. So, you imagine you're in school from the age of 18 on, trying to be a doctor. This is why I have a lot of compassion for my colleagues. Like, I get it, guys. We all sacrificed so much from nearly 2 decades. I'm in my late 30s now, started that process at age 18. So 20 years later, I've invested $500,000 into my education, which is growing through compound interest in ways that nobody wants to really imagine. And I've been trained to do one thing, which is to work within the medical industrial complex. They're pumping us out with medical diplomas in order to serve a very specific role. So if that's my role, fortunately, I have mommy and daddy at the top of the echelon to tell me that I'm doing a good job. But if now I have this sense of doubt about the guidelines or whatever coming down from these organizations, it's like I'm only trained to do one thing, and now I can't rely on the person employing me to do that.
Mhm.
So that was really the impetus for me to I just had to step away altogether. And that was my ego out the window.
Mhm.
Not that I had much ego left anyways after medical training, but it was the ego, it was the financial insecurity and instability. How am I going to make a living doing this? But if I was doing that for 40 more years, knowing what I sort of, I had an inkling of it, just from this pharmaceuticals just simply not working or causing more problems. But then to realize, oh my gosh, Pfizer's actually paid for the study that we're actually deriving our guidelines from. That was like, well, if I'm going to do this for 40 more years, I'd rather not feel bad at the end of the road, and at least feel like, hey, I wasn't making as much money, but at least I'm doing what feels right to me and is actually working for my clients.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. If that's not a conflict of interest, paying for the study, I don't know what is. But yeah,
Right.
I would love to get into that. That, your transition from kind of the mainstream medical model. You said you were trained at Kaiser. Is that okay for me to say?
Kaiser in LA, yeah, in
Kaiser
Hollywood.
in LA, yeah. And now you don't do anything like that at all. What was that transition like for you, and how did it all come about?
That's a good question. I suppose that the big thorn in my leg was that as we were doing more and more things, let's talk about pregnancy, because that's what everybody loves to talk about. But let's look at pregnancy alone. You have a hospital birth, and we only look at healthy mom, healthy baby. The problem with that I was finding is that when I saw them back for their next birth, they felt very, very shaken by the experience, even if it was an undisturbed, all natural birth or whatever. But the vast majority of births in the hospital are not undisturbed. They're not all natural. There's all sorts of interventions. And then we are there to save the day when things go awry. So when I saw my colleagues celebrating how great we were able to do that C-section to save this person's life, but then looking at why did they even end up in the operating room, it was like, oh boy. So the first thing is we intervened a bunch of times and created an opportunity for some really bad things to happen. Baby's heart rate drops, the placenta is not getting enough blood flow, there's not enough oxygen circulating, right? And we save the day, and then we say, look at how great our institution is. Fine. But also, there was nothing from conception all the way to the point where they were in the hospital having a baby that would have rectified the underlying cause of the dysfunction that landed them in the operating room, or with a bad perineal laceration, which is when the skin tears during birth. Not every woman has a laceration, and we're not talking about a cut like an intentional cut. We're talking about the skin tearing. And the reason that many women don't have that is because their body and their tissues are extremely well nourished. So what I started realizing is, okay, people aren't healthy. They're getting pregnant. Sometimes their bodies are being forced to get pregnant through REI, which is the IVF and the IUI and all these injectable hormones. We force you to get pregnant without ever getting the soil healthy. You then end up in pregnancy with all these complications, and now you're compelled, and sometimes you're not even able, you're healthy enough to have a home birth. And now you're in the hospital, and now we're doing all these interventions to try to, again, avoid death. You end up in the operating room, and we're like, whew, close call. But had we just focused on the health of a woman as she's embarking on that fertility journey, and the health of the man for that matter, you don't have placental issues. You don't have growth issues. The perineum is stretchy and elastic. The pelvis is stretchy and elastic. You don't end up with a lot of the hypertensive disorders, gestational diabetes, all these other things that land you in the hospital. And now we need to save the day because we didn't take care of the soil from the very beginning. And this is a resource issue. This is a mindset issue. And this is a lot of, doctors and nurses alike, and midwives and many nurse practitioners, et cetera, saying, don't worry, we can do this for you. But that's not how this goes. When you get pregnant, there's a lot of personal responsibility. The system is just not set up to do all of the lifestyle things, which I hold near and dear, and the Czech Institute hold near and dear, that if we got those things under control in the beginning, you wouldn't even need an OBGYN. You could have a home birth or a birth out in the woods for all I care, and you're still going to have a normal birth, an undisturbed, sometimes even painless birth relative to what a lot of people go through in the hospital.
Wow.
So that was a long roundabout way of saying that I realized that, man, I can either keep doing what OBGYNs do, which is bring a scalpel to the party every time that you're called, and Pitocin and all these other pharmaceuticals for that matter, or how about we do everything we can to keep you from even needing somebody like me who did all that training? And 70% of our surgery is our training is surgery. So when you're that good at surgery, we're pretty darn good at surgery. Everything looks like a nail and we're walking around with a hammer or a scalpel for that matter.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to start taking care of people on a more holistic, level. And then that took me down the path of what does real holistic care look like? It's not just natural remedies. It's taking care of the spirit, the soul, and the body all at once, and the mind.
Yeah, I love it. Truly
Beautiful.
holistic for sure. And I love the way that you frame that. I have never made that connection with IVF and certain fertility treatments. Maybe there's a reason why you're not getting pregnant naturally. And of course, we know that, there oftentimes is something that's maybe related to lifestyle, or as you call it, getting the soil healthy. That makes so much sense when you say it like that. But I've never really thought of IVF as almost like forcing a body to get pregnant, when the body's innate intelligence is saying like, hey, whoa, we're not good. We're not able to carry a healthy pregnancy, but then we're kind of forcing them into it. I've never heard that before. That's such a great way to phrase it.
And I appreciate that, Mimi. And if we look at most issues that plague people, they want to blame the system for not getting their cardiac meds right and everything else. But they're also not able to take care of themselves, whether it's for financial reasons or they're in a city like LA where you have some of the richest and poorest people in the country living on the same block. We've got all these social determinants of health. And even when people have means, they're just like too easy to open the door to the IVF clinic and say, let's just do this now because I just want to be in control of it. That's one way to do it. But we also know that IVF, and I'm not picking on IVF, I just think that we need to get all of the fundamentals in order. And if that still isn't working, then we can start talking about IVF and IUI, which is when you take semen and you basically override a woman's cycle. And then at the right moment, you put the semen in there, you inject something called HCG. It causes the ovulation. And then you make it happen. You sort of try to play God there in a way. If we haven't done the fundamentals, then you're bound to maybe get pregnant. But then if patients also have a higher risk of all the other things I talked about. So it actually is a risk factor for a lot of complications in pregnancy, IVF alone. And the vast majority of people who go to IVF haven't really worked with somebody like me to fine tune their innate, healing wisdom, supporting their adrenals, supporting their thyroid, etc., through more natural means, so that their body is equipped with all of the resources it needs to grow a baby and have a healthy birth.
Interesting. And so I'm picking up that this is increasing. This approach is significantly increasing. And
do you mean the holistic approach or
the IVF? Like,
oh, okay.
And it's not necessarily, is it out of just like laziness in general, health practices and fertility optimization as a part of a lifestyle? Or is it more of this like transactional nature that our world seems to be ever evolving into, where we want shit to happen now and we don't want to work for it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Chase. I think that inherent in or implicit in your question is, if people are having to rely on this medical system to do these really expensive, very invasive means of quote forcing the pregnancy, people are like, yeah, but people don't have access to food and clean water and all that. And that's true, but those people can't afford IVF. So the people that are showing up in the IVF clinic definitely have the means to work on this for 3 to 6 months before they even try to start talking about fertility. And also people who are pursuing those means generally are a little bit older. So they haven't had that extra 10, they've had 10 more years of perhaps not having the education or the insight perhaps and the self-reflection on how they could actually improve their health.
Sure.
There are people like you that I wouldn't expect you guys to have any issues with getting pregnant, but if you did, we could fine tune some things. And then you may not even have to go down that path. I guess that's kind of what I'm getting to. I think it's multifactorial.
Totally. Well, I would love to get in a little bit of those, very specific, fertility related lifestyle practices and modalities, and even like, we're both in great shape, and it's such a priority. Health is such a priority, but like we also have been through adrenal exhaustion, both of us in our 20s, and I completely tanked my testosterone. And I'm still on a roller coaster journey at 32 after 27, just bottoming out my hormones. And so I do have this thing in the back of my mind, which is like, I look good today, I feel good today, but I do have, less than optimal hormones. And how is that going to translate when I get to the point of wanting to have a child? So, what are these lifestyle factors for men and women that we can just hit the ground running on now?
Yeah. And I mean, these are completely free, so even let's assume we have no expendable income, right? You're the person who's working 3 jobs. You're barely, making ends meet. You go to the grocery store and you buy, let's even say that you buy the non-organic produce. Here's one example of how our society is not really fundamentally in alignment with health. You drive up to the grocery store and you find the parking spot closest to the door of the hospital. You don't have time to exercise. You can't afford a gym membership. I get it. But you're about to haul 60 pounds of groceries out and you got your kids in tow. So you give each kid a bag and you park as far as possible from the grocery store, and you're doing now a farmer's carry all the way to and from. Elevators, escalators. At the airport, I will lug my luggage up and down the steps because I know I'm not going to move. I'm going to be sitting in a plane for 3 hours and on the tarmac for 3 more hours for refueling, right?
People on the escalator look at you like you're a nut
You're
job.
insane.
Like, what? What are you're taking stairs?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Overachiever. Right. And if you're not sleeping and you're not doing anything else, like you probably should a little bit. But if we're just looking at one simple fundamental thing, we're not moving. We're 90-degree angles on the couch, watching Netflix every night, eating ice cream. If you're eating ice cream every night and you're not moving ever, it's not just a matter of getting fat. You are putting non-food into a body, and that body is not pumping anything. Your cellular machinery is just doesn't have to do the job of a healthy person. So we could go down that path so far, but the 7 fundamental principles, well, 6 of them are checks. They're sleep, diet, movement, hydration, breath, and mindset. And mindset gets into stress management, knowing self, knowing your purpose, archetypes, etc. What is your big dream? Where are you headed in this world? But then I also added some EMF mitigation in there because we are swimming in EMF. And if you look at this, works within kymatics and whatnot, there is definitely something that is happening to us, being immersed, just flooded with electromagnetic everywhere. But even that one aside, moving, sleeping, eating as well as your resources will allow you to eat. That's where we start. That's the bottom line. That's the buy-in, so to speak.
Yeah.
And you can get into some of the functional stuff. So once we have all that stuff in order, we've got your amalgam fillings out, we've got your gut back in order through some probiotics and taking some dairy and gluten out. I mean, it's all the basic stuff that I'm sure people in your show know about. Then we can step it up and we can start looking at the chakras. We can start looking at some functional medicine testing. There's a Dutch test, which actually looks at how your body produces hormones from the adrenal cortex, which are your salt, sex, and sugar regulating hormones, how those interact, let's say, Mimi, for you, with the ovaries. And if that system is out of whack, we're noticing low waking cortisol, for example, those types of things, then we're looking at adrenal exhaustion. But it's not just adding in what's lacking in the algorithm. Like, we have to consider, why are your adrenals smoked? So we can't polish. You have to go back and get some rest. You have to turn the lights off sooner. You have to wake up with the sun, go down with the sun. And so these are all things that are pretty darn free.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of meeting a person where they're at, their resources will go. What I'm doing is not like rocket science. It is very, very fundamental stuff, but there is an education piece there. And there's also some habit change and developing healthy habits and self-love. I mean, that's a big part of this, is how can we love ourselves better than just, a Ben and Jerry's tub of ice cream every night.
Mm-hmm.
I love Ben and Jerry's. I freaking love ice cream. It's the best thing on the planet. But if you're eating that every single day and then you're fertility doc and they're like, you know what, let's just pump you full of hormones and get you pregnant, you're bound to have the same metabolic function when you're pregnant as you were before pregnancy, which is why you probably were struggling with fertility in the first place.
Yeah. And it requires patience and presence and being associated with the process. I think we want to disassociate with things that are uneasy and that have resistance. Right. And so getting in the work, even if the resistance has to do with just being patient.
Yeah.
Like, tomorrow you're not going to be able to take something and, be able to have an erection. I mean, I guess there are, ways of doing that, but it's like, you might have to do a few weeks of waking up with the sun, going down with the sun, taking your eyes off of blue light in the evening or the afternoon, looking at your mineral and various like nutrition elements or nutritional deficiencies. And it's not going to be ready tomorrow. It's going to be this relationship build. And I think that's where a lot of like, they seem simple because it's lifestyle stuff and it's free, but we'd almost rather have the expensive transactional, give me a 24-hour turnaround on the result.
Yeah. And even through the lens of like functional medicine, which I really, I'm not pushing back against it, but I also try to get people to realize that just replacing dysfunctional system with another, there's a use for, and as there is a use for allopathic medicine and Chinese medicine and everything else. But if you're doing this as a replacement for a healthy lifestyle, again, to the best of your ability, education, and resources, then you're just going down the same path. We're just replacing one system for another. A lot of the functional medicine testing feels good because it's like $1,000 worth of labs and then $1,000 worth of supplements. Right. And now you feel kind of married to that. Well, that's not really serving anybody if you aren't sleeping well. And if you're doing, feels like a headbanger every time you wake up on Monday morning to go and do. So again, a lot of these interventions don't require all the expensive testing. I do all of that well if I think necessary, heavy metal testing, gut, stool testing, etc. But we have to really ourselves get back to like, what is it that is prohibiting me from harmonizing with my surroundings?
Yeah. That's a great way to put it.
You're having waking up crabby, having a hard time getting, the energy up to have sex. Those are pretty natural things that we all want to do in our 30s is have sex. But most people are struggling with their libido. They're struggling with testosterone. What is the underlying reason that a young, healthy man doesn't have testosterone, has the shoulders, the back, and all of that? It's because their adrenals. And that takes time to repair, like you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Word. And everything that you're talking about, we started this conversation or this part of the this question, I guess, with fertility, pregnancy. How do we make the soil healthy? Yeah. But everything that you just went over is not just for pregnancy. This is like for medicine for life. This also helps you prevent these lifestyle diseases like cardiovascular disease and cancer and autoimmune diseases and everything. It's like, it's not just for pregnancy. So if you're a man or if you already had kids or whatever time in life that you are, like, these are all just foundational principles of being human in our current world. Right.
Yeah. Excuse me. The, at the heart of this conversation is that, you can either, and a friend of mine gave me this analogy. He's like, you ride a mountain bike and your tire goes CO2 cartridge, you can pump it up and get home. But if you don't actually fix the flat tire, you just keep buying those expensive cartridges. You're just juicing yourself up every time you go on a ride. That is very expensive, and it's one way to go. But
cut out for a second.
That's not that's very confronting. It sounds very anti-feminist. Oh, did it cut out? Can you?
Yeah. Sorry.
It was like a 15-second.
Yeah. The last thing you said was that's one way, and it's a very expensive way.
Okay. Let me switch. Let me see if it might boot me off here.
Okay.
But let me switch my internet here.
No worries.
Can you still see me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think we have a more stable connection now. So anyways, that's one path. But at the, when we consider, the reason I talk so much about pregnancy is that if a person is young and they can't get pregnant, they're not healthy. There are very rare instances in which there's an anatomical or some underlying congenital issue, genetic issue, for example, that pregnancy is not possible, but that's a very, very small percentage of people. Mm-hmm. So women are gifted with a vital sign, which is a predictable monthly bleed. And they should have not even monthly, it's actually 13 per year, which draws into question, why do we have 12 months? I won't even get into that history, but 13 full moons, 13 bleeds. That's actually how nature intended it. So this is the natural cycle of our of nature, of our environment. So a man doesn't have that. A man thinks he's doing great, like me and you, Chase. We ended up in adrenal fatigue without having any clue. But a woman would have noticed, oh no, my pattern is getting off. Like I'm not having periods as frequently or whatever. And that is a sign that like, oh, we need to get to the underlying dysfunction. So men go their whole life not realizing how broken down they are, whereas women can actually have this vital sign visible. And if they're not having a regular predictable bleed, something's going on there. So we should embrace that as an opportunity to explore and ask some hard questions and get that stuff, kind of situated before we start trying to force our bodies to do this incredible thing, which is to grow a baby.
Yeah, seriously.
So good.
It's interesting that a lot of people, they approach pregnancy, and this is great that they do this, but it's like, okay, I want to try to have a baby. I need to get healthy. Okay,
Right.
how do I get healthy now? And I can appreciate that to a certain degree. Of course, it's better than the alternative, I suppose. But then what happens after? What happens after you get pregnant or after you have the baby? Then what? Like, is it just back to like, well, I guess that was it. So I love your approach of like really, and ours really is, something we talk about on every podcast really is developing relationships with these different aspects of our life, with movement, with food, with, spirituality, with ourself. Like you can be eating all the right things and taking all the right supplements. If you're still living in shame every day of your life or judgment or guilt for yourself, that is not helping any aspect of you. And so I love that you're really, truly taking a holistic picture. One thing I've heard you talk about in several different, different podcasts and conversations and just talking with you as a friend, you have a really unique way that you look at how our current world and hopefully the more beautiful world that we all know our hearts know is possible in the future, how we support women and what that looks like currently. And how do you see our current medical system or our current world neglecting women? And what happens when we truly support women? And what does that even look like?
Wow, that's a great. You sent me this question before, and I know I wrote something down, but I'm also reading this book called Woman as Healer, which talks about the history of women in the healing space since ancient Sumer. I mean, we're talking thousands of years ago. And I don't know of any truly matriarchal societies, but at least way before Christianity kind of became the sort of default mode for the world's religions, women were honored because of their creative process. I mean, they can give birth, and we honored that as an important, obviously, an important attribute of our society. And as we've seen societies rise and fall, we've seen a devaluing of women. It happened in Rome. I mean, it's happened in all of the major civilizations, and I think we're actually there now in ours, because fast forward from ancient Sumer, where they were polytheistic and they had goddesses and deities that they prayed to for fertility, for the harvest, whatever, because of this inherent sense or an innate sense that women are connected to nature. We know that you guys cycle with the moons. Like there was an acknowledgement and an embracing of that. Like, wow, the power of a woman. And therefore we have powerful female gods, obviously. But then, fast forward, then we get Christianity, and now we have one single God who's in the figure of a man who is not even of earth. He's actually up in the clouds above earth, governing over earth. And so you look at the history of midwifery. I'm working on a solo cast on this topic. That's why I was rereading this book for like the third time, because it's packed full of really good information. You can imagine that when the Christian, let's just say the different denominations of Christianity through the Crusades and everything else took hold, anybody who was connected to nature was not of the man above in the clouds. And it was actually a threat to the establishment that was developing, which currently is still a part of our political and our religious systems and really the medical industrial complex. So what I really wish to see in the new world is for us to re-embrace the power of the divine feminine. And I'm not speaking as some sort of woke neo-feminist. I mean, we are actually doomed if we can't reimagine how we interface with nature being fully represented in the divine feminine. In the reductive model of medicine, we only look at the things that we can control. And this is a part of this sort of monotheistic evolution of our religious doctrines, which is that medicine was born from the mindset that anything that we can control is something worth studying. And we know we can't control birth. We know we can't control death. We know that everything we do out there to try to mimic nature falls flat on its ass. This happens in agriculture. This happens in governance. This happens in medicine. So what I would really love for us to see is to take a step back and appreciate the role of the divine feminine, the divine masculine. And that is going to require us to get out of the way and to hold space as the divine masculine. And we all have a little bit of each. It's like the homosexuality spectrum. Like nobody is fully into just men or just women, at least very, very few. Like there's moments where you're like, wow, that man is like, I feel something with him, right? But you're still very heterosexual, right? That's the whole Kinsey report. I won't even get into that. But in our exploration of masculine and feminine, we have both of those powers. It's the yin and the yang, the yin being feminine, the yang being masculine. But we've overemphasized masculinity, productivity, control, versus the feminine being the receiver, the going with the flow, the rhythms of nature. I mean, that has all become the sort of the play of witches. You know, it's the immeasurable, it's the connection to nature. It's using the plants the way that nature delivers them in their whole form, as opposed to synthesizing it in the lab and trying to control it. So for anybody out there who's curious about this, the way that I have imagined the masculine is the sides of a mountain, and then there's a river running through, and that river is just going to erode and move as the river sees fit. You don't control a river. The only way to allow a river to do what a river does is to hold the the parameters of the basin to allow her to fully express herself. And this is ever more important in how we show up at birth.
Yeah. Oh, it's so spot on. That's how we've done everything. We've taken the feminine, that is water, and we've put it in a kiddie swimming pool. And that's how we've contained it. Well, there's no life in that water. You know?
So right. Yeah.
And then you can't, like you're saying, you can't grab and control directly water, the feminine, the liquid. It slips through your fingers. It has to be guided. It's penetrate. You know, you must penetrate the feminine, right? But in a way that guides it, so it's such that the power of it can be channeled.
Right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That language is tricky, because then it's like, oh, we're guiding the feminine. I know that you were questioning that as you were saying it, but in nature, the mountain asks nothing of the river. The river asks nothing of the mountain.
Right.
They are working in
Yes.
concert
It's
with one another
co-creation. Yeah.
to mold the landscape. And that's the new world is going to come from a balance between those two incredible forces. But we are so focused on control and the masculine that, you know, even men, we show up and we just want to fix it. There's nothing to fix in your female's life. There is absolutely nothing for you to fix. You just need to hold space for her to do the magic that comes only through the lens of the feminine.
Yeah. I love
Perfectly
that.
Put.
So we are living in the reality that this world will exist, this more beautiful world. What does that actually look like? How is that? What is the expression of everything that you just explained and the lack thereof? How does that change? Like, what is that different expression? Do you know what I mean?
Explain more.
Like, how does our world look different in maybe the medical system from your lens? How does that look different if we show up, if men show up, if women show up, if providers show up in the way that you just explained so beautifully? What are the differences that we now see that are manifested in maybe the space that you work?
Yeah, so I think the way that it would look is that instead of asking, what can I do to fix the problem? The question would be, what is in the way of this person's journey or healing? And removing those barriers. The term that comes to mind is salutogenesis, which is really related to the innate wisdom of the body to heal. If you cut your finger, your body goes back to normal.
Yeah.
But we don't take that approach to virtually anything. We forget that your dying or your birthing is not a lack of medical intervention. Like, these are natural processes. And we know that when a person has a hospital-based birth, for example, that we intervene more and more and more. And now we've created a situation where medicine actually is required if the mom and baby are going to survive. Versus if you actually experience and sit with a natural physiologic undisturbed birth, you see the roar of the feminine come through.
Mm.
And all that we're here to do is to hold space for that. And everything else works out. Everything down to how a woman positions her hips, her legs, her torso is helping the baby, in commune with the baby, helping the baby get through that pelvic canal in order to be embodied with these more subtle energetic bodies. But as soon as we numb her out of that experience, as soon as we start intervening in that experience, we naturally are throwing things off downstream. We just aren't looking for them in the literature.
Sure.
That's why women feel so traumatized in this, is that this was a natural thing. And then you forced the plant to go this way when the plant was actually going to go this way.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got a plant it's a plant, but it hasn't been growing in the way that the natural fields of our planet and the cosmos would have otherwise intended.
Yeah.
So it's less control. It's more supporting the natural processes and only intervening when we absolutely have to.
Yeah. I love that. That's when I imagine myself, when we were on your podcast, you asked this question, like, what is your ideal birth scenario? And it was a really fun topic and question to explore in my own mind, just because I hadn't really gone there in exact detail. And that's exactly how I picture my birth scenario. If we choose that, is letting my body and trusting my body, and not just in pregnancy and birth, but also I've spent years of listening to my body and responding to my body in love, so that when I get to pregnancy, it's not a new language that I have to learn. It's just an allowing of my body's innate intelligence. And you describe it so beautifully.
Oh.
Well,
this is what I think about all day long.
yeah, totally.
I'm glad I'm communicating it okay.
Yeah, I definitely want to pull a little further on the sort of like the place of the masculine thread, if you will, and specifically how it pertains to pregnancy and birth. There's obviously some male oaf-like archetypes out there as it pertains to supporting the birth process. I mean, literally like jokes from guys about like, oh, I had my catcher's mitt ready to go, and I'm watching sports and eating popcorn as this is going on, and like whatever, that's fine and funny, I guess, for a minute, but like I think we're ready to step into like the proper placement of masculinity as it pertains to the pregnancy and the birth process. What does that look like in an ideal world? What's the most vital placement of masculinity in the birth and pregnancy process?
I think one of the greatest consequences of the reductive model that we've developed, where, hey, if you're going to cut into a person, you can't think of them as a person. You think of them as a meat suit. Mm-hmm. And that mentality, after Galen's time and into the sort of Renaissance period, we started reimagining with our monotheistic doctrines that, the spirit and the mind are separate from the body. That allows us to dissect a body. Otherwise, that would have been sacrilege. Because if the soul is going to be tethered to this physical corpus, then we can't possibly dissect into it. That's ludicrous. And so fast forward, now we have birth and those analogies and those little quips that people use about the catcher's mitt and this and that. It treats the body as if this is just an organ system that's going to spit out this human, which to me is not even really possible to put into a sentence, and constructively into a sentence. So when we show up in birth, and women know this, they have an intuitive spirit about this. Like, they're oftentimes talking to the baby in utero, and they're communicating with the baby, and the baby will even tell them what their name is. The baby will tell them, I'm okay, I'm not okay. But because we can't measure that, it ends up being something that we can't actually act on. And we love acting. We just love getting our hands in there. So as a father, having been, in a birth, even in our house, the first important thing to remember is that there's nothing for you to do here to fix anything. Just stand back and hold space. But more importantly, I really want you to pay attention to what's happening. You're witnessing a transformation of spirit on the part of you. We're distracted so much that we forget about like what's going on in there. There's the transformation of spirit on the behalf of a pregnant woman going from the archetype of maiden to mother. And this human being is emerging into the earth school for the very first time. When we come to the table with a fix-it attitude. That's how we develop this idea where the baby comes out, we dry the baby off, we check all the vital signs, we give a shot in the foot, we put goop in the eyes, we get mom all cleaned up, we put a diaper on her, and then we wrap this little baby up like a tortilla, like a little burrito, and pop it on her chest. And that's a job well done. Well, that misses the incredible elegance and rapture that comes in that first moment when a baby comes out. So I don't know if it's so much a role for men, but it is an opportunity for men to connect with the power of the feminine. And because we've stopped paying attention, it's easy for us to be like, okay, healthy mom, healthy baby, bye. And we walk out of the room. But if you're sitting there and you're really present and you watch what's going on and the baby takes its first cry, and you see it on men's faces, but they don't want to admit it. The reason men faint so often in the labor and delivery room is because they are being blown apart by something that they had never even conceived of. It's not a catch or mitt. You're saying all of that in order to make this a little more easily digestible. But there is nothing like watching a baby emerge from your wife's vagina and then land on her chest and she starts crying. That is the learning curve. So if men could show up in that way and just hold space and just pay attention and be present with that, which we're not used to doing, it's uncomfortable to be present. That's where we start to shift from this dominant masculine society to a society in which we actually can embrace what the feminine brings into our world, which is the creative process of the cosmos, and it's driven by love. That's where it's at.
Oh, come on.
Preach.
God.
I don't know how anyone could listen. I honestly don't know how anyone could listen to that and not say, hell yeah, that's the experience that I want. But a lot of times, as you speak to so often, is, we're not informed of this option, of this, all of the aspects that go into informed consent. Like, I feel like it's not actually happening because a lot of women don't even know that what you just explained is an option for birth. I certainly didn't 10 years ago. You only see it depicted in hospitals, and you see a home birth from 200 years ago, maybe. But I can't think of the situation where a woman hears what you just said and is like, nope, not for me. Does that happen? I mean,
well, yeah. I mean, our mythologies are really, really strong. I mean, we've been conditioned to, like we've been saying, for somebody else to have the answer for us. But I think the greatest myth that we've told ourselves is that hospitals are a place for safety, and they advertise safety through the lens of control. So I know we were going to get into some of these specific, questions about the healthcare system and how I might approach different issues. But even where we give birth is a really important question, because we have the myth of safety, that if you just pay your insurance company the premium and your co-payments and your deductible and all that other stuff before it actually kicks in, another conversation for another time, you go to the hospital, you're going to be taken care of and you're going to be safe. And again, safety is a surrogate for control. The more we control it, the safer you'll be. The problem is that there's a lot of iatrogenic death in hospitals, meaning something done by the hospital that killed you that otherwise wouldn't have happened. There's a lot of medication errors, meaning we're giving the wrong dose, we're giving the wrong pill, we're giving it by IV instead of IM or as opposed to oral. All sorts of things get mixed up because nurses are overworked, they're underslept, and they're underpaid. And doctors got too many patients too. Like, they go in and they review everything. They come up with a plan before even meeting the patient. So our system doesn't really do safe. It keeps you from dying. I mean, that's really the extent of it. And if you go in there relatively healthy, you might come out relatively sick. So when we consider just how much money that we're spending on the healthcare system, what we're getting is the illusion of safety. But if we take a step back and we actually look at data from around the world where home birth is still relatively accessible, there is no difference in outcomes based on the metrics, even the basic metrics of blood loss, fetal loss, maternal mortality. There is no difference between the home birth and the hospital birth. One of the big issues is that because there's such a disconnect between the home birth community and the hospital community, midwives at home who would otherwise have transferred at day one of labor, they may wait a whole another day to hope that something changes in order to avoid going into the hospital where they're going to perhaps be, scorned. They're going to be insulted. They're going to be shamed. The women that are there to get, safety are shamed. And so they wait too long. And then whenever that transfer should have happened, doesn't happen. And now we're actually in a pickle. So this is not to say, by the way, again, I'm a patient advocate. This is not to say everybody should have a home birth, but if you feel safer at home than you do in the hospital, the chances are, based on what we know about the physiology of labor and the impacts of stress and fear on physiology, that you're probably actually better off at home with a midwife who's trained, who's apprenticed, and has a good relationship with a nearby hospital. That's the ideal. I also understand why people are having free births, because they don't want to even step foot near a hospital. And if a midwife is going to recommend that and take them off of their sort of intuitive path of having a baby, then they just don't want that at all. But the underlying reason that people are having more home births than free births is because they don't buy into this slogan of safety for all in the hospital, because they see what happens there, especially for young healthy people. So it's not for everybody, but home birth is generally way safer and supportive of patient autonomy and respectful of informed consent and respectful of the right to refuse treatment than anybody practicing in the hospital system.
That is a major, I feel like, myth of our culture and society. The women that have home births are sometimes shown or depicted in movies or wherever, like, oh, they're just, another hippie that, is afraid of science or whatever, like science hater. And what you just explained couldn't be further from the truth, obviously. And that's where again, going back to ideal birth scenario, I've never once pictured myself in a hospital setting, whether that's a birthing center or our home, whatever it is. But I've just always known, like, no, hospital's not for me. And I don't shame anyone for whatever whatever, like you said, if you feel safer in a hospital, it's probably for you. If you'll feel safer at home, which I do, it's probably going to work out in my favor. And I would love to continue kind of this myth busting, because you are so well educated, in addition to just your commitment to honesty and real patient advocacy. We knew that you would be the perfect person to go into some of these controversial topics and maybe bust some myths and misconceptions. And just spoiler for the audience, on this episode and every other episode of The Medicine, we do not shy away from having difficult or controversial conversations when we can bring love and consciousness to the conversation, which of course you always do. So there might be some triggers in here. If you're listening and like, oh, that's not what I believe, just stay calm and have an open mind and just be open to the conversation as Nathan shares. But so you shared, some myths and misconceptions about home birth and hospital birth. Is there anything around those two as far as myths that you would want to share before we move to the next one?
I think the epidural conversation is really important. Granted, the risk of something really, really bad happening with an epidural, which, by the way, is when you sit, you hunch forward. We find L3 to L5 that's in your lumbar spine. We find a nice open spot there between the vertebrae. There's a big gap, which is why we use that spot. I don't do it, but the anesthesiologists do it. I tried to learn how to do it, and then my residency program was like, don't do that. Just do your job. And so I wanted to actually be really good at epidurals, but I never got there. But what they do is they put some, basically a cocaine derivative, which you recognize as lidocaine. They usually use lidocaine, if I recall, or bupivacaine or marcaine. There's all these different canes. And then they add an opioid like fentanyl to that. And it goes into the fluid that surrounds your spinal cord. And it numbs the nerve roots that carry pain from your extremities up to the brain. So you can't feel anything below roughly your xiphoid process. You're pretty numb. The risks, would be like infection or bleeding inside that space. Those are all super low risks. So the anesthesiologists are correct there. The likelihood of you hitting it would be like trying to pop a balloon with a blunt pen in a room. Like, you can't damage the spinal cord with one of these very, very fine gauge needles. I'm sure you could, but it would be extremely unlikely. So that's what they'll tell you in the hospital. The other part of that, though, is, and this gets into the home birth process, women have shorter labors. The reason that women generally don't tear as much, those lacerations I talked about, is because they will they're in attunement with what the position they need to be in order for the baby to get through this tight passage. So if you're numb from your xiphoid process down, your legs are useless. They used to do walking epidurals. They don't do those anymore in most hospitals. And that's where you have the numbness, but you can still use your legs. This is a strong enough blockade that you don't even have motor function in your legs. So you can't move. You can't get into those natural positions, all fours, side lying, runner's position. You can't do any of those positions because your legs don't work, and you can't feel anything in order to guide those movements. So you have you have a much lesser chance of tears. You have a much lesser chance of dystocias, which is when like the shoulders get caught. You have shorter labors because those movements actually help to facilitate the process. So, what the literature says is that an epidural slows down labor on average by 1 hour. It could be a whole day. I mean, it really, really depends on the person. So we give these generalizable statements to people. And for some people, it is really helpful. You've been in labor for 2 days at home. Nothing's changing. Let's get you some sleep so we can give you some energy to get back to the process. But for the vast majority of people who have a birth without an epidural, they're like, that was way faster and way easier than when I was in the hospital with an epidural. So I'm generalizing here, but that's I think one myth about the epidural thing. It's more than just the infection rates and all of that. That actually is disruptive to the woman's movement and the dancing and swaying and bouncing and child's pose and all of that actually helps facilitate labor.
Yeah. We have a friend, Marissa, who's an incredible doula, and she's had 4 kids of her own. And she says this motion is lotion when it comes to birth. Yeah. And I love that.
Yeah, I love that too.
Okay. So next one, circumcision.
We'll just be brief with this one. It is genital mutilation, period. Yeah. I'm circumcised, for everybody out there wondering. And if we had a little boy, we would have had to have a hard conversation, because I probably did 200 of those in residency. It was a part of our job. We would put sugar on their tongue, and they would go into outer space. Imagine your first Sour Patch Kid. And then we strap their arms and legs down. You put these big clamps, and then you cut around the bell of the clamp and cut off all of the excess foreskin just below the head of the glands, the crown of the glands, what you would see as the mushroom top on the penis.
Yeah.
And of course, when the penis is erect later in life, you can't tell the difference. But there were kids in school when I was younger, when circumcision was like all the rage, that they would have like, the skin that comes, extends over the glands, and they would get made fun of for it. So there was these societal pressures to match what daddy has, so to speak. And I probably had that mentality at one point, but after having done so many of them, I won't ever do one again, first off. But I also want people to really understand there is absolutely zero benefit to circumcising your child. It gets a little dirty under there. You just pull the skin back and clean it, just like your ass crack or your armpit.
Yeah.
Seriously, I think about that all the time. We're currently in the middle of watching this documentary called American Circumcision, because we want to know, we want to prepare ourselves and have this tough conversation before it comes, if we, ever have a son. And they're talking about, someone who is pro circumcision. They have both sides on this documentary. They're talking about the cleanliness and, it can get infected and this and that. And I'm like, have you ever taken a look at a vagina? Have you ever noticed how many folds and petals and places and crevices there are? Like, that to me is a laughable argument. It's like, we teach little girls how to clean themselves. Why is that any different for a boy? Do we think that they can't handle that as a little child? It's laughable. And then once you dive into what you just explained and seeing it done and hearing that there is no real benefit to it, it's hard for people to swallow. I think especially for
sit and understand. Parents. It's really been like, wait, what? Why?
Yeah.
Why?
I have a hard time believing that a perfect little human body needs a major surgery on day 2 of their life. If everything else is healthy.
Why mess with nature? I mean, there's foreskin there for a reason. I mean, men who we don't have a good comparison between the two, but people who have had foreskin and then have it removed later in life say that they have less sensation. But I mean, who knows? That's actually beyond the point.
Right.
If what I always say is the burden of proof lies to that person who wants to deviate from nature. And we have absolutely no evidence to support circumcision. I have no idea how we got there, but the guy who made that film, American Circumcision, I think he's actually a Jewish rabbi, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. So I may be wrong, but I think that the primary mover and shaker who got that film going is somebody who had done so many what's it called, a bris, where you cut the foreskin off in Jewish tradition. But
Yeah.
that's a good question. That's an easy one for me though.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Another one, obviously quite charged, but would love to hear your perspective, would be abortion.
Oh yeah, there's the big capital A.
Big one right now.
As a patient, as an advocate for women, I am fully on board with autonomy. For me, it is not my belief system that is supposed to be guiding how I practice, how I counsel. Otherwise, it would be called coercion. And I want to emphasize that having an abortion is probably one of the hardest decisions for many people. I think there is a small percentage of people who are also like, oh, I don't want this baby. Let's just get this. Let's just kill it. I mean, like that's what people have this mentality. And maybe even if that was 50%, there are very, very important reasons for us to have access to abortion, whether it be medical or procedural abortion, even up to the second trimester. And I did a whole podcast episode about this recently, which, looking through the lens of, let's say, something like anencephaly, that's where the baby's brain doesn't develop. It is completely incompatible with life. And if it survives in utero up to term and you give birth to this baby, the baby's only going to live for a couple hours up to maybe a couple months, depending on how severe it is. So they've got a brainstem that will help them breathe and do the vital functions, but it's not sustainable and it's going nowhere. The baby doesn't grow. The brain is not there. There's a lot missing. So if that diagnosis were to happen at that mid-gestation formal anatomy screen, many women would say, I think I would just like to terminate. I don't know what I would do in that situation, but it's not my body. It's not my decision to do. And I know that we have close friends who are in exactly that situation, which is why I tell that story. We shed so many tears with them. It was one of the hardest things that they've ever gone through because they were trying to get pregnant for like 3 years. And that was the news they got. And so, people say things like, you can always have another baby or whatever else. Like on the other side of that, we need to hold space for how hard this decision is.
Yeah.
And I think you're doing the right thing. It doesn't matter what you think. It's not your position. So I do think that, obviously up to like 4 to 6 weeks, I think everybody should have access to that. I've heard stories about people that are like, they're doing abortions in the third trimester. I've never seen it. I've never met anybody in my wide range of travels who have supported that. Infanticide, just letting the baby die and starve. I've heard of that. Like people have made those claims. I've never once ever seen or heard that. And I'm a pretty out there sort of guy. So I'll stop there. What question?
Yeah.
No, that's
I could go on and on about this one.
I'm so grateful for your transparency and honesty. It's so helpful as we all of us navigate this.
Yeah. And something I listened to that abortion episode that you put out because it was in the heat of everybody, one more thing for people to be divided on. And I loved the way that you framed it. I think it was in your intro where you said, both sides of this conversation, whether you are pro-choice or pro-life, is coming to the conversation from a foundation of love. But the other side does not see that. For the pro-choice, that person is saying, we want to support the woman and her ability to choose what's right for her body and her situation and her family. Let's support women. And the other side of the conversation, pro-life, we love babies and life, and let's do everything that we can possible to make sure that this baby does come into, saving a life, basically. Right. And it's not seen that way. You're seen from the other side's perspective as potentially a monster or evil or crazy. Right. And I just loved the way that you framed that. And it really opens up the conversation that is so nuanced. It's not black and white. Just like every other damn thing in life, there is no black and white. There's a lot of gray area. And so I just wanted to thank you for that because it hit me and it was like, oh my God, that's so true. It's love at the foundation of both, but we're not seeing that.
Yeah. And I thank you for that, Mimi. I'm glad you listened to the episode as well, because you put yourself out there and you get a lot of hate mail for those types of messaging. Yeah. And the big elephant in the room as well is that if you want to force every woman to have a a pregnancy, or to have a baby resulting from a pregnancy, whether it was an intended or not, number one, men need to step up to the plate and figure out what they're going to do about where they put their cum. The other thing is, we as a society can't be shaming women for everything from having a nipple out while they're breastfeeding their baby
Right.
to shaming them for being a single mom, or shaming them for not being a single mom and just being a quote, just a housewife.
Right.
Like, we have completely devalued women in our society. And now it's also on you women to be forced to care for a baby that either you maybe didn't even intend to have with your intimate partner. Maybe you already have 5 kids and the condom broke. I mean, we just don't know.
Yeah.
Or perhaps that small percentage of people who were raped and now have a pregnancy they have to be confronted by. And of course, these other women who are going to be forced to have a baby that has no compatibility with life. So if we're not willing to live in nuance, then we put everything into a binary of right and wrong, then all of those women I just mentioned slip through the cracks, and they're left looking around for some support for our society. And our society is like, deal with it. You're just a woman. Go deal with your womanly things.
Mm-hmm.
And that also needs to be a part of the conversation if we're going to be really, truly bring all of our love into the conversation. We need to really step back and figure out, why is it that so many women are feeling compelled to do a variety of things that don't feel right to them, but have been imposed upon them by legislators and outspoken men and other women in the society and in our society.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you exist and you are an advocate for women. We just need like 1 million more of you and we'll be good.
Yeah. You got to clone me or something.
Yeah. Right. Next one here, ultrasounds.
Yeah, this is a really, the ultrasound conversation is really, really tricky, because what we always talk about is ionizing radiation. Like, if you stand next to a microwave, you like put your face on the microwave and just fry yourself for a couple of years, you're probably not going to do well. Same with like being a truck driver and you're just getting, selective ultraviolet light coming through a window your whole life, and half of your face looks like it's falling off and the other half looks youthful. Like, there's a lot of reasons for us to be considerate about radiation, but the evidence that is out there that is governing our guidelines about ultrasound use, specifically in pregnancy, is that it's non-ionizing radiation. It's not like being hit with an X-ray, and they're right. The problem is that we have plenty of other evidence outside of pregnancy that suggests that when we use continuous waveforms, specifically with these high-frequency Dopplers, that it actually does disrupt embryologic development. And this is in Petri dishes. This is in animal and rodent studies. And something a little bit more woo-woo is to consider, if there is a greater field governing why trees grow in this way and branch in certain ways, etc., that plant is inherently intelligent as to where every single cell is supposed to go as it's developing from a seed, which is the same as an embryo in our uterus for the most part, to a trillion gajillion celled organism that is now hovering over my house. So inside the uterus, if you consider that 2 gametes, the cell from the man, the cell from the woman, the egg in the woman, sperm in the man, they meet, they create an embryo, a zygote as we call it. That divides and that divides and those divide, and then now you've got 1 billion cells. While that's happening, and you can see this in real time on a time lapse of like a zebrafish embryo developing, all of these billions of cells are somehow figuring out where they're supposed to go in order to form this zebrafish. They're not like chatting over coffee. Like, I don't know how they know where they're going, but it's that's the miracle of childbirth, of growing a baby from nothing. And suddenly, bam, you've got organ systems and a functioning immune system and a nervous system. And you've got all these chambers of the heart that somehow miraculously formed, all from one stinking embryo. Mm-hmm. If you look at kymatics, which I think is very fascinating, either in a glob of water or on a tin plate, you put a bunch of salt granules on the tin plate and vibrate the plate at various frequencies, you will get a completely different but beautiful geometric pattern. And those salt granules, for damn sure, are not intelligent. I mean, maybe they are, depending on your sort of worldview, but those little salt granules seem to just go somewhere on the plate in order to form these incredible patterns. Well, if vibrating a tin plate with salt on it can explain how we can get these various patterns, and you'll get the same pattern at 528 no matter what. It's this, there's the 528 pattern. It's quite impressive. If you then go into the 3D and you look at this zebrafish, you see these little salt granules that make up the zebrafish going to wherever they're supposed to go based on who knows why. You can call it God's spirit, you can call it the field, you can call it whatever, but there's something impressive there. And if we are going to argue that there's an intelligent nature, an intelligence in nature, which I certainly do, and we can even say there's some spiritual something that's happening here, could it be that shooting high frequency waves at this, just like with that tin plate, could perhaps give us a different geometric pattern? And the evidence outside of the body says yes. So for anybody out there who is pregnant, getting an ultrasound is fine, but getting an ultrasound every single time you see your OBGYN in that first trimester is probably something we should be putting the the kibosh on. It heats up tissue, it heats up those cells, and it is naturally interfering with whatever field is governing where those cells go.
So if you're working with me and I'm like, I want as little interruption, I want as little intervention as possible, just do the bare minimum, what is absolutely necessary, how would you advise me?
The first question would be, how sure or how sure are you about when this baby was conceived? And that can be like, how regular are your cycles? Or like, man, we had sex the last time was 5 weeks ago when we were in Peru. That's when that's when we conceived, almost certainly, because you have normal periods and you haven't had a period now for a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
That would be, if that's the case, we don't need the ultrasound to confirm how far along you are, but it does help us confirm and put you under the 28-day gestational age wheel, which is relevant if your 28-day cycles are exactly 28 days every single time. And then also, like, let's say that you've got a pregnancy, but you're bleeding a lot, or you're a smoker with a history of gonorrhea, etc. There's a higher risk for ectopic pregnancy, or if you have an IUD in there, you got pregnant, it's possible it's a higher chance than otherwise with that IUD in place or history of PID like gonorrhea that it's going to implant in the tube. That's called an ectopic. That could be a medical emergency. About 20% will resolve on their own. But if it keeps growing and ruptures the tube, you'll get catastrophic bleeding inside the abdomen, and now we have an emergency. So if for some reason, let's say you had 2 prior ectopic pregnancies and now you're pregnant again, we just want to confirm it's in the uterus. That would be a good use for that. But many, many women, especially in the midwifery community, get 0 ultrasounds. And we just wait and see what happens. And there's 8 billion people here on the planet for a reason.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, that's great. The next one to talk about, and obviously I'm getting to the point where I'm looking at any traditional procedure and just questioning it, and wondering if there's more that we should be aware of or know about. And so I've thought this about, vasectomies, and like, hey, it seems like a lot of people are doing this, have been for some time, but am I missing something? Is this one of those that's actually okay? Are we potentially, is there another approach to this? And then, maybe tube tying as well.
Yeah. So I told you guys that I have a vasectomy scheduled at the end of the month, and I think I'm going to cancel it because I've been having some real doubts about what this means to be blocking up my reproductive tract. It's blocking it, but it's not tying them. We don't actually tie them. We actually remove a chunk from the vas deferens, which carry healthy sperm up to the urethra, and then you ejaculate. So the evidence about vasectomy, of course, now I've been diving into it, is that, low risk of bleeding, like a hematoma forming under the skin, low risk of infection, low risk of failure. They're like 99.9% effective. There's very little pain. It's a pinch, and then that's what they say. We always say that it's a pinch, but it's probably more than just a pinch, but it's relatively pain-free, and you've got a couple weeks of recovery, and then that's that. No more babies. The problem is it's irreversible the way that they do it. There are some doctors that will try to put it back together, but it's not a guarantee. And you're holding back some fluid, something that's being created by the body that is meant to be expelled. So energetically, something doesn't sit well with me, and I'm almost sure I'm not going to do it at this point. But in that same conversation with my wife, the burden is now on her through fertility awareness methods to be darn sure when I can and can't come inside of her. And I don't like coming inside of her anyways, because she doesn't like having that. But hey, if we get carried away and we're having great sex and it just happens, we don't have to worry about it with a vasectomy. Now, perhaps she's during her fertile window, and then she's going to be faced again with a conversation around abortion. Do we have a third baby? Is this baby 10 years younger than our current 7-month-old? It's unlikely that we'd be getting pregnant at 47, but you never know. So there is this certain security, and it's like the men should stand up and do their part. And this came up in the business of birth control when I was on the panel in Austin. Yes, we should be doing our part, but part of that is that we've suffered long enough as women, and now men should suffer too. And I don't like that language, because nobody should be suffering. Like,
Yeah.
it's not like we're keeping tally on who's suffered the most. Women have definitely outsuffered us. There's no way we're going to catch up. You guys have us outnumbered, Mimi.
Right.
And so the same conversation happens with tube tying, and for women who are definitely seem to be a little bit more in touch with and attuned to their energetics. On one occasion, when I was after residency, I did a sterilization procedure for a woman who had been consented by another doctor. She was ready to go. I showed up and I did the procedure and I removed the tubes. But she was under the impression we were tying the tubes. But that's not really something we do anymore. It's actually removing the tube decreases your risk of ovarian cancer, because they're thought to be derived from the tubes.
Got it.
If you're not going to use them, why not, instead of taking a piece out, let's not, and we don't clip anymore because they fall off and end up elsewhere in the abdomen. Let's just remove the tubes. That broke her heart, that she didn't have her tubes anymore. So on one hand, men need to step up. On the other hand, these surgical irreversible procedures, they come with a cost. And that's, I think, part of the conversation for us. So while Stephanie's really starting to track her cycles, we just can't have sex. And if we do, we need to use a barrier method, because she is determined, based on all of the information out there now about hormonal contraception, to not be on either an IUD or any hormonal contraception, especially the pill.
Yeah.
So it's a really, really tricky conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
it is. There is no easy answer.
Nuance.
In the space of birth control, for sure.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And similarly, energetically, I'm like, man, the more I lean into this space, I'm like, spiritually, like, is there something here? This is a life process. And is there something just obscure about interfering with that? So yeah, no, I really, really, really appreciate your insight. We've talked a lot about fertility already, but like I personally just have some very specific questions.
Yeah.
I hear about it in kind of I'm complete bro scienced out. Like I'm a master's in the University of Bro Science, which is the most dangerous thing you can possibly do. So I really want to speak specifically about like fertility. I mentioned, like, I've been through my own, hormone challenges, and you hear various, protocols and modalities for, of course, testosterone and growth hormone, but then like fertility as well. And it's coming into more of my awareness, just because I'm looking at 32 years old and I'm like, hey, are we going to have kids in the next few years? Do we want kids? What can I be proactively doing from a lifestyle and protocol perspective to support this? And I've heard theories, right? Like, icing your balls, red light therapy, but then like herbal supplementation. What's kind of the starter pack for fertility supporting protocols and lifestyle patterns? Which we already mentioned some of them, but what else could be legit?
Yeah. So I think that the conversation around I'm going to try to look up something here for you real quick. I think that the conversation around fertility goes just beyond the hormones and the whatever, serum lab values or whatever else. I think that's an important part of it. But there's also this area of conscious conception, I think, that's really helpful. And I start my clients off with this, which is, when you get pregnant, you can do this consciously by inviting in the soul, the spirit of this baby, right? So that spirit baby's out there. I mean, and these are not my ideas. These are borrowed from a variety of traditions and many really, really great books that are out there. But if you can imagine that you and your partner need to be in the right place energetically, you need to, really be connecting, because that baby, if that baby's looking for you, they're looking for you to bring them into a life of love and light. And that, in many partnerships where both people are working these, jobs that are just keeping them so busy, and they're timing it like it's time to have sex, boom, 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 done. Let's go back to doing our thing. If I was the spirit of a baby, I would be like, I don't know if that's the life I want to go into, right? Like, that's the notion of conscious conception. Yes, people get pregnant accidentally. Yes, people don't even think about it. But I will say that whenever people go to the fertility clinic and they have a consultation with somebody and they're so stressed out about it, we got to get pregnant yesterday. They leave the consultation handing that responsibility, the burden, over to somebody else. And then bam, they don't even end up back in the clinic because they just magically conceived after years of trying, after years of biohacking. So there is an element of that. And I won't go further there, because then people are like, but what about rape? And it's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
There is still some mechanics there that happen. And, we, it's neither here nor there in this conversation. From the standpoint of your question, Chase, the first question I have for people is, why aren't you getting pregnant? And 40 to 50% of the time, it actually falls to the man. We used to consider about 150 million sperm, healthy sperm. And we're talking they're well formed, one flagella, they're not spinning circles, they're looking for that egg. You look at it under a microscope and we would see a pile of them. Now we're seeing about a fifth of that, and we still consider it normal. But just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal.
Right.
So worldwide, we've got a decrease in fertility amongst men, or virility is the word I use, or fecundity in women. Fecundity is the likelihood that you're going to get pregnant on any specific cycle. And I think it's somewhere around 20% for like a 35-year-old, probably like a 25-year-old actually. And as you get older, the likelihood goes, down for the woman. But there's also the male that we have to think about. So on top of all the things I just already talked about with the quote biohacking and the functional medicine and all the things we can do from a lifestyle standpoint for women, for the men, I recommend a couple things. A lot of men are doing a lot of saunaing at high temperatures. The only data that we have about sauna use and sperm health, let's say, is from Scandinavia. And they found that men that are in high temperature saunas for multiple times per week actually have a decreased sperm count and motility compared to non-sauna users. Then you also asked about red light therapy. And the red light therapy, the evidence that I was able to find is that there have been several small studies, but red light therapy, which has been popularized outside of even sauna use, is going to have some sort of metabolic effect at all tissue levels. But specifically when it's hitting the testicles, we are seeing an improvement in sperm count and motility. But I wouldn't recommend people go straight to that if they haven't gotten the bases covered.
Right.
Cold therapy for the balls is kind of an interesting question. And the problem with it is that the testicles have this muscular, I can't even remember the name, but there's this like strap of muscle that will contract when you're cold, keeping the testicles closer to the body, and it will relax when you're warm. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, Chase.
Oh yeah.
You probably
Yeah.
That when you're hot outside, your testicle, the scrotum gets long and loose because it's trying to cool the testicles off by getting away from your core temperature.
Yeah.
And so the opposite happens when you're in cold. By cooling them, I don't know if we necessarily can say for certain that would speed up the process, but definitely heating it from the sauna standpoint will sort of retard the process, so to speak, of developing healthy and plentiful sperm. And then other than that, I mean, really, it goes back to the nutrition. The one thing I get all of my clients on, even if they're like normal sperm or whatever, like they did that one test and they just happened to get like a decent number, but could we get that higher? Could we improve the likelihood? The one thing I get everybody eating is oysters. So oysters are loaded with vitamin D, copper, zinc, manganese, protein, omega-3s, and that will invariably improve the quality of your sperm and the number.
Got it.
And that's great for men and women.
Yeah, shellfish are amazing. There's also a lot of taurine, which is this sort of underappreciated nutrient. I talk a lot about that with Lily Nichols on her episode when she came onto my podcast. She wrote Real Food for Pregnancy and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And she is this like wizard nutritionist that totally bucked the system like I did and is doing her own thing because she knows it works. Knows it works.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, awesome. All right. Oysters on the menu. Perfect.
All right.
Those little smoked cans of oysters. They're amazing. Yeah.
Awesome.
Couple per week.
With some of the friends that I have, they're literally like my age. It's just more and more popular to be getting testosterone replacement therapy or some level of hormone therapies. And usually you look that up and the first side effect says fertility challenges and decreased sperm count. Yeah. That being said, I've also known people who've been on TRT since their late 20s, or maybe they're former bodybuilders or physique competitors, and they've been using it with various other, protective mechanisms through their consumption of, whatever drug they're taking, that have been able to have children. What are you seeing as it pertains to TRT? In addition to lowering sperm count, we're seeing testosterone lower. Kind of collectively as well, and it seems like more and more people are leaning on these therapies. How does that relate to fertility?
Well, on one hand, testosterone is really, really necessary for the production of sperm. The other problem with taking any isolated hormone is that it's feeding back to the hypothalamus, the pituitary, oftentimes the thyroid, the adrenals, etc. And you're not getting all of the other things that come from, from the adrenals, for example. So on one hand, testosterone therapy should help sperm, but we do know that when people are on it for a long period of time, that they actually get a disruption in somewhere in that axis of the endocrine system, and they generally have a harder time getting pregnant. That doesn't mean that it's not possible. You just need one happy little swimmer to meet that egg and magic happens. But what I would always tell people is I wouldn't come off of it right away, but if you're trying and you're having a hard time with it, I think weaning off of the testosterone replacement therapy, giving it 3 to 6 months for you to try to get, some normal cadence to how your endocrine system is firing, and then trying again, trying to get pregnant again, testing your fertility and count out, you're going to see almost certainly a positive improvement. But that's not the case for everybody. So I don't ever give like a sweeping generalization to anybody, but a lot of people who are taking testo for a long time do end up having an issue with fertility and virility in the future.
Cool. No, that's super helpful. Really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many more questions that we have on our list that we're clearly not going to get to, and we just will have to have you back multiple times. But one thing, if we can make it short here, and I know it's a big topic, but you have a lot of experience. You've already mentioned it a few times with medicine and psychedelics. I'll start over. I've been curious about pregnancy and psychedelics, if those two things should be separate, or if you've seen positive benefits, if it should be allowed. Like, what are your thoughts around psychedelics and pregnancy? If a woman, say, has had some medicinal psychedelic journeys previously before getting pregnant, is that something that she should stay away from during pregnancy? In addition to that, piggybacking is if a woman is pregnant and she's like, you know what, I really want to try this. What are your thoughts there?
Well, before we even get into psychedelics, let's just talk about cannabis, because we've been shaming women over the ages for doing everything from having orgasms to drinking wine during pregnancy. Cannabis grown by a responsible farmer, let's say that you're a biodynamic farmer down the road in organic soil. This is a plant that's provided by nature, and it almost invariably is going to be harmless to the pregnancy. The issue is, and actually, let me bring up a study to demonstrate that. If anything, it actually perhaps promotes neurodevelopment of the fetus. And there was one study out of Jamaica that actually Kyle Kingsbury turned me on to. It's a couple hundred people, and in Jamaica, cannabis is a part of your culture. It's a part of what you do. So they took two groups of people. One group, they were smoking it. They reported smoking cannabis daily during their pregnancy, and the other group, not nearly as frequent, if at all. And they followed them up over the long term. And they actually found that the kiddos in the uterus who were being exposed to cannabis actually had greater neurodevelopmental scores than the non. Wow. Now, we can conjecture all we want, but there hasn't been a lot of studies like that anywhere, especially in the United States. The studies that have sort of scorned the use of cannabis in pregnancy are looking at women who smoke a lot of cannabis, and people who smoke a lot of cannabis in the United States tend to also not generally take great care of themselves. That's a generalization. Cannabis is a big part of my life, and I consider myself pretty healthy. On the other hand, if you're using cannabis and occasionally it's got a little something mixed in, it's not from a great source, you're also having a couple beers every day. I mean, like, you just don't know what the story is. Maybe you're, instead of a joint, you're smoking a cigarette once in a while. There's all these confounding variables that have shown that these kiddos maybe don't do as well from the US studies as kids who aren't exposed to that, but we also don't know what else that kiddo was exposed to. Mm-hmm. So when in the United States, again, it's like, hands don't do anything. Everything is unsafe in pregnancy. A lot of people are like, clean as a, whatever the term
clean
is.
As a whistle.
Clean as a whistle. Is that the term? I was like, clean as a whistle doesn't make sense. Clean as a whistle. And they of course have a beautiful baby at the end. Had they added some really, really well-grown cannabis, could it have even been better? We just don't know, because nobody's really doing the randomized control trials. So then we take the conversation to psychedelics, and there is zero data. We have absolutely no data. However, if we consider what our parents' generation was doing in the 60s and 70s, I'm sure there was some LSD floating around.
Yeah.
I don't think as a baby in the uterus, I don't think it was like, whoa, what's that? I think that they're already probably immersed in the world of DMT in the uterus.
They're on their own trip.
Right.
Yeah, right. They're out there in outer space anyways. So I'm not so sure that it would necessarily matter anyways, but there are some reports out of the Amazon tribe, the Shipibo and some other indigenous cultures within the Amazon River Basin, where ayahuasca is an important part of what connects them to Mother Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're using ayahuasca throughout pregnancy, throughout childbirth, and into postpartum and beyond. Like little kids are just taking ayahuasca all the time. Wow. Now, are they ripping through the cosmos every day? I don't think so, but they don't seem to have any issue. If anything, perhaps they are neurodevelopmentally delayed based on our US's perception of what a child should be able to do, which is to not talk with the jungle, but is to read at the age of 3.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is our metric? What's that phrase? Like it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society.
Right.
So if that is like, we got to stay over here, guys, you do your weird American thing, we're going to do our thing. If we would consider that challenged developmentally, then so be it. But we have no data to support that it's dangerous, that it causes fetal demise or anything else. And I don't think that those people's would report that either, even if we really did do a robust study.
Mm-hmm.
Touchscreen functionality is shown to be, less optimal.
Yeah, right.
Amazonian,
right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Well,
we did use it in our pregnancy, and I met the soul of this baby, and she is the soul I met when she was in utero, and it was very challenging for Stephanie when we did it, because it's a challenging experience. But for me, it was one of the most rewarding things I ever could have done. So people can take that as what it is.
Amazing.
Did you, and we can cut this out if you don't want to say, but I'm just curious, was it mushrooms or was it?
Yeah, it was mushrooms.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, beautiful.
Yeah, because I'd prefer to do that than something synthesized like LSD and like MDMA and all those things. Those are definitely a no-no in pregnancy for anybody who's listening. But, mushrooms grown in your own planter, who have been loved and sung to and everything by Papa, it then goes into the uterus, and we can connect like that.
Yeah.
All
right.
Yes, ma'am.
I love it. I'll take it. Well, as we come to a close, I just want to say thank you so much for being here and sharing so much of your wisdom and honesty. We are obviously grateful to have you as a guest and gift your wisdom to all of our listeners, but just so grateful to have you as a friend now. And we just immediately connected with you. And I hope we are friends for a very long time, because you're just such an incredible human. So yeah, big love to you. Big hug. We do have some rapid fire questions for you. So the medicine podcast is all about forming relationships and using these medicines that help us form conscious relationships in every aspect of our life. We'll focus on body, mind, and relationships. But currently for you, what feels like medicine for your body?
Medicine for my body, it comes through being present with my daughters. That is medicine for me. Not spending time, but being present. That is really a learning edge for me, but it feels so good. And I've missed them so much when I was traveling this past week. So
yeah. That's great. What feels like medicine for your mind?
I think medicine for my mind is connecting with people in an authentic way. Where it gives me my mind permission to go into that nuance, and that really serves me so well. Being able to ask those hard questions and people showing up in conversation and holding space for me to get a little weird. I mean, that really does serve me intellectually, and I can't do that in the system. So these conversations are really serving to me in many ways.
Love it. It's a love language for us.
Yeah.
Get weird, get deep. What about for your relationship or relationships in general? What feels like medicine?
For the past couple of years, we haven't had a lot of in-person interaction. And this past week I was in Austin, and just sitting on the floor and doing nothing with good people. Like I was staying with Tosh and Kyle Kingsbury, and just being with them in their space in all their glory. is something I've really, really missed. And with all the Zoom calls and podcasting, it's great. I mean, I'm so excited to meet you guys in person. And I really have missed that in-person interactions. So that is definitely sustenance for my relationships, is getting to hold people and touch them and kiss them again.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Absolute nourishment. So good. Thank you so much. I know there are people listening right now, men and women, who are like, I got to get connected to this guy. How can we work with him? How can I put dibs on him to be my OBGYN? How do people work with you?
So we could do one-on-one consultation through my website. Everything's at belovedholistics.com. And I also have this collaborator program for health coaches, midwives, etc., where I make myself available on retainer, basically, for a monthly fee for you to bounce anything off of me in order to better serve your clients, your patients, etc. And I've got midwives, life coaches. I've got a whole sorts of people that are doing that because they don't want to have to engage with the system, knowing what they know about the system.
Sure.
And so I may even say, listen, this is really serious. I do think that this needs to go to the hospital, be further evaluated, but that's very, very, very rare. So anybody who's interested in doing that, I'm still accepting some collaborators. They can find that again at belovedholistics.com. And I am considering attending home births around the country and flying with a big pile of gear and just showing up and being there for people that want to have that home birth, but they can't find a midwife or anybody locally. So anybody who's interested in exploring that or needs that, just reach out to me privately, again, through the website. And then I've got my podcast as well, the Holistic OBGYN podcast. You guys are going to be on there shortly.
Yeah.
And you've already recorded, but we'll be releasing that one soon. And guys, it's been a huge pleasure. I feel the same way you do. And I hope that we get to see each other in person and get to grow this friendship even deeper.
Yeah.
100%. 100%.
All right, you guys.
Thank you so much, brother.
Thank you so much for listening and being here, spending some time with us. We are truly grateful to you. You could be listening to any podcast in the world, and you chose this one for a reason. Go check out Nathan and his work at Beloved Holistics. Check out his podcast. It is incredible. His connection is deep and far and wide to other amazing individuals. So go check that out. And all of that information will be in the show notes. Go spread some light. Okay, bye.
Bye.